Hi, my name is Phil. I like to talk about politics. In this video, I'd like to discuss how, whether it be recent revelations or the recent protests, have caused Nigel Farage to lose his job on the LBC radio station. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, yesterday afternoon, LBC, which is the radio station that you may know has been famous for hosting James O'Brien, as well as Nigel Farage and a few others, announced that Farage would be stepping down with immediate effect. It's alluded to the fact that his contract was coming up shortly anyway, but, you know, it wasn't like saying we're not going to renew it, at which point you could say, oh, why is that? Or maybe it's just they're not renewing it because he is no longer of any political relevance. Could be anything. But, no, they're ending it with immediate effect. They're not waiting till the end of that contract. So I'm not really sure why they put in the thing about the contract in the first place, because they're ending their association immediately. So what has caused this? I mean, they didn't say, because they threw in the red herring of the contract there. It is possibly related to a question that the radio station were posed about letters written about him from his private school from 1981. They refer to his singing of Hitler Youth songs and other examples of his fondness for the Nazi ideology. Not that we needed to see a letter from 40 years ago to know of his admiration for them. Remember, he had his Brexit Party stooges ape the Nazis, who famously turned their back on the Reichstag in 1930 by doing likewise in the European Parliament earlier last year. Now, a bit of a head scratcher that someone who uses anti-Nazi World War II imagery when it suits him actually is very fond of the Nazis and likes to use their techniques just for giggles. The letter describes his open fascist and racist views and how they impacted on the decision over whether or not to make him a prefect at this school. Now, I'll post a link to a tweet where I saw a copy of the letter down below if you want to read the whole thing yourself. But there are a number of points of interest regarding his dismissal from the radio show. Because, as I say, it's not immediately clear exactly what caused it. As far as I can tell, there's been no public reason given for the early termination of Farage's contract. Presumably they'll be buying him off. I don't think they can. Obviously, it has to be to do with his racist views. That's clear. Normally, that would be a good enough reason to sack anyone, but not in the case of Nigel Farage, because if he were to take them to court, the radio station wouldn't have a leg to stand on, because it's quite clear he was being a racist for many years. In fact, he was put on the radio show because he was one of their resident racists. Now, obviously, in case people were observing the lockdown really tightly, you may notice that we've been having a bit of introspection along the old racism in the UK, just as in the US. And at such a time, you'd have thought that Farage, the great political opportunist, would actually have kept his head down a little bit. Instead, in light of these protests, he launched an absolutely stinging attack on the protesters, likening them to the Taliban. Now, I have to say, for a political opportunist, he wasn't really lining himself up with the public mood there, was he? After all, remember, he's supposed to be the great champion of Brexit, and the Brexiteers would keep trying to tell us that it's not about racism. And I do understand, by the way, that some people who voted leave did not leave for racist reasons. I get that. But the arch Brexiteers did, but they try and tell us that it's not. Doesn't really work when those same people now are arguing against anti-racist protests, particularly when they are doing so vehemently here. But it has to be wondered at, if he was removed from his post for racist or xenophobic views, you know, let's say it was based on this letter, what new has actually emerged? Because nothing at all, as far as I can tell. This wasn't the result of hitherto unknown behaviour or belief. Nigel Farage hasn't done anything recently that is in any way surprising, and there's nothing come out about him that is in any way surprising. He doesn't hide his racism, and clearly, judging by that letter from his school days, never has. Now, which suggests that the real reason he's been dropped before his contract expires, to say nothing of not having the contract renewed, is presumably public pressure. And, I responded to a question on Twitter earlier this week where someone was asking what is really the impact of these small stands against racism. And I said that they are of very practical use. Yes, the people of Bristol are very pleased that they've had a statue chucked in the river. I think it's been recovered now. It's not going to be put back, is it? But the wider country, how does that affect it? I think it's a very practical use because after Brexit, race attacks increased in Britain. The police figures show this. Xenophobic attacks increased in Britain. They also increased in the wake of Boris Johnson being made Prime Minister. There was a bit of an old spike there. And again after his general election victory. Why? Why would those increases coincide with these events? Really, it's because many extremists are kept in check by society's values. After these events, the racists believed that their views were in line with the majority. After all, didn't the majority vote for Brexit, which as far as they were concerned was all about xenophobia, all about keeping the outsiders out? Same with Boris Johnson, another known racist, being made Prime Minister, and the general election result. It all made them feel like their views were normal. It made them believe that their vile views were shared by the majority of those around them. The check had been removed. Some of them didn't, follow those checks anyway, but there were those who do. They weren't right, but perception is everything. And in such an atmosphere, if someone doesn't speak out against their actions, they are essentially going to allow themselves to believe that the majority are with them. The recent protests culminating in the removal of a statue that the people of Bristol had long campaigned to have removed sent a rather different message to the racists, that their views are not shared by wider society. And this is why I believe some sections of the media and other commentators have been so desperate to have these statues returned and preserved and to knock this on the head, because you can see it now spreading across the country. Statues are being removed. Sometimes they're being removed temporarily. There are a few where there is genuine debate. I noticed Baden-Powell statue has been temporarily removed. That's an awkward one. That's a genuinely awkward one. Like a lot of historical figures, not very pleasant views by today's standards. But his statue is representing something that's very inclusive, the Scout movement. But they've removed it, at the moment, good reasons or bad. But the people who are campaigning against the removal of these statues, they don't care about Edward Colston. They don't even know who Edward Colston was until a few days ago, any more than I did. They don't really care about Cecil Rhodes or Robert Clive when it comes to that either. What they care about is the argument. If these statues are removed and if this spreads across the country, and it's not an act of vandalism. One of them was an act of vandalism. The rest, it's councils doing it. In London, there's been a review going on to look at what racist statues and monuments may exist to have them removed. But so, they've got the approval of the general population. And what that means is if that carries on, then their values are a minority view and they'd have to face up to that. If a statue was damaged by an actual act of vandalism, if that's what it was, the damage would be repaired. Because it is. Sometimes monuments are vandalised. They're repaired. If there are not the funds to do so in the local authorities, then you get fundraising. And people tend to be pretty good at raising funds for local monuments that they're proud of. So if the council couldn't afford to do it themselves, people would club around and do it. We see it time after time. But it would be restored. If it met with the approval of the local population, it would be restored because they are powerful symbols. But if people cheer the removal of these symbols of imperialist oppression and the authorities go along with it, they're losing the argument. And losing that argument means that they have to face up to the notion that when they hurl racist abuse at someone, they are not speaking for the silent majority, but for the spiteful minority. And if more demonstrations of the public's disdain for racism occur, if this keeps going, if there's some momentum built up, then perhaps many of them will curb their behaviour again in the future. it won't be expunged completely. It's not like racism didn't exist before 2016. But every act, like the protests, that inspires other acts against racism as well, including the removal of platforms for the very worst of them, such as a certain Mr. Nigel Farage on the LBC radio show, that turns the tide back the other way. And that's why it's important to keep being inspired by these things and to celebrate whenever the tide is turned back, even if it's only by a little bit. But those are my views on it anyway. It wound around there. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.